Thank you, guys. Hi, my name is David Middleton. I'm a policy advisor at DEFRA. I'm working in the Contaminated Land policy team. So we have responsibility for the Part 2A Contaminated Land Statutory Guidance. I joined in March this year, so not so much experience with the previous guidance, but certainly have enjoyed seeing the first steps of the new guidance being used. So, as you know, government remains committed to a precautionary approach with regards to contaminated land. And I think when there was issues about the guidance use, it was the primary legislation was first assessed and decided it was strong enough to remain, and that the issues were with the statutory guidance. Hence, numerous consultations and versions of the guidance were run through in draft, and this was issued in its final format on the 10th of April this year. It fell under part of the environment theme Red Tape Challenge, with the headline figure of benefits estimated at being £140 million cost saving to business, and that's to do with the excess remediation. And there is a commitment to review the benefits once it's all finalised and bedded in. I think would be the best time to do that. I thought I'd just take you through a few of the benefits, a few of the key changes, and then I'll run through how we're hoping to help it bed in by producing technical tools that are mentioned within the guidance in the form of R&D. So, firstly, on some of the benefits come from the revised guidance. The idea is that the regime will now focus on higher risk sites, the ones that where there is actually a risk to health. And they should be dealt with first. A key element is also to speed up local authority decision making, helping them dismiss the low risk sites first so they can then focus on the higher risk sites. And we also want to see more consideration of the health impacts that these determinations have. Guidance is much shorter and simpler. Although I wasn't around prior to April, I have had a look at the old guidance, and it is quite unwieldy. Hopefully this sort of more plain English style makes it a lot easier to read. It's more outcome focused, greater clarity and greater discretion for regulators to make local decisions within the parameters of good regulation. And I think key is more certainty around when land is not contaminated land in a legal sense, which will in turn reduce regulatory uncertainty and associated costs for brownfield developers. Transparency is a key element to the guidance also, making it easier to understand and greater predictability for those affected. And also, a very key point, greater recognition of the scientific uncertainty that surrounds risk assessments. I think it's obviously now deemed to be more proportionate, consistent and accountable. Obviously it's only been around since April, so I think some of these things are obviously perhaps yet to happen or in the process of happening. So it's been it's interesting to watch. Some of the key changes were about the uncertainty over when land is deemed contaminated land in the legal sense. So tackling that was a key part of the changes. A new introductory section to the guidance outlines the broad aims of the regime, which is to remove unacceptable risks while keeping burdens manageable and sustainable. A new risk summary section. Local authorities must produce a risk summary that is understandable to non-experts, before land can be determined as contaminated land. And I think the most talked about element of the changes is the new 4-category test. I think the idea for this underwent different guises. I think in some earlier drafts it was a red and green category, but ultimately it's been a 1 to 4 numbered category now. So 1 and 2 is contaminated land, 3 and 4 is not. Category 1 is land that is clearly problematic, and there might have been land in the past similar that's caused issues, so that can easily be defined as contaminated land. At the other end of the scale, category 4 is land that can be described as land that is clearly not contaminated land. And I think it's the important element of this categorisation system is in the middle. It's the 2-3 border, and that's where things are less straightforward, and there needs to be more detailed consideration by the local authority about the assessment. The idea is that these categorisation system will offer a legal framework against which technical tools can be benchmarked. It could describe certain categories or boundaries between certain categories, and it's going to be particularly important in terms of reducing uncertainty over when land is clearly not contaminated land in the legal sense. So I'll talk about a bit more about the 1 to 4 category a bit later on. There's now a bit more explanation about human health issues. I think there was inadequate explanation about SPOSH, significant possibility of significant harm, which is obviously the key legal trigger when deciding if land is contaminated. So there's more explanation about that, what is significant, about the possibility of it occurring, and deciding if that possibility is significant, and that's where the local authority will then decide whether regulatory action is necessary. Clarification on the remediation requirements is key. New guidance clarifies what can be reasonably expected from regulators by way of remediation, and that you can only force remediation to a certain point, which is obviously, using the 1 to 4 category, it's the border between 2 and 3. So only up to the boundary between the 2 categories. And there's also clarification on the status of soil guideline values and generic assessment criteria. It talks a bit more about how they should and should not be used with regard to the statutory guidance, and it is made clear within there that they can only be used to indicate that land is likely to be well into the category 4, and importantly makes clear that they cannot be used as a one-size-fits-all remediation target. So to try and help make the guidance work, there's a few supporting elements. 2 pieces of research and development, and a recently announced national experts panel. The MBCs and the Category 4 screening levels will ultimately make a toolkit for those assessing contaminated land, and the idea is that the outputs of the expert panel will help promote consistency. So I'm just going to talk a bit more about each of these in detail. So there's specific reference in the guidance to normal background concentrations, and between October 2011 and March this year, the British Geological Survey took to determine what are MBCs for a certain number of contaminants in the form of 4 work packages. Work package 1 was concerned with review of the available contaminant data. Work package 2 explored the principal available data sets. A robust statistical methodology was developed under Work Package 3, and the final deliverable and a key element was the production of a series of technical guidance sheets for the selected number of contaminants. So within the guidance, we say normal levels of contaminants should not be considered to qualify land as contaminated land, be it due to the natural underlying geology or low-level diffuse pollution, for example, the historic use of leaded petrol. This is, of course, unless there is particularly good reason, scientifically based reason, to consider otherwise. In some cases, Part 2A has been determined on sites with normal background concentrations, and obviously if this was applied nationally, large parts of the country would be caught by the regime with obviously hugely disproportionate effects. So firstly, I'll just talk a bit about the soil data sets that the BGS used in their project. Firstly, the data will include results for priority contaminants. Chosen contaminants were arsenic, benzoate, cadmium, copper, mercury, nickel, and lead. The sampling was systematic rather than targeted, so as to represent a broad range of land uses, and it was important not to bias the contaminant concentrations towards a specific type of survey. For example, targeted contaminated land or mineral exploration data was completely avoided. Be spatially extensive across England with a good sample density. Where data was sparse, results were employed from other areas. For example, the benzoate pyrene calculations used results from Wales and Scotland. Number 4, soils were collected and analysed to an internationally recognised standard and have the associated quality assurance. I think that's self-explanatory. Number 5, unambiguously defined total concentrations of contaminants. Now, I won't pretend to completely understand this part, but I'll read it. But they employed XRFS, or neutron activation analysis procedures. These were employed as a first priority. Based on the fact that the total amount of each element present is the fundamental point to the collection of the samples. Number 6, be compatible with other available data sets. No single soil data set was available to completely fulfill an MBC, so there's working with a number of different data sets, so compatibility was a key point here between them, and provide good resolution of the sample site coordinates. The BGS had to dismiss good and informative data sets because they were rendered much less useful due to site access agreements, which meant they could only be released to the nearest 10 kilometre. Sampling could only be released to the nearest 10 kilometre. So they looked at a number of soil projects for this work and have acknowledged in their report that new data is continuously being produced and can add to the work in the future. Identifying the important domains. The term domain was used by this project to identify areas of England to which high concentrations of a contaminant can be attributed as a result of readily distinguishable controlling factors. Probably the most important was the parent material, extremely important controlling factor. The varied geology of England meant that this contributes to significant variability in the natural contaminant concentrations. They used something called soil parent material model to gather this, which basically combines underlying geology and surface deposits. For number 2, non-ferrous metals, mineralisation and mining. When a contaminant is enriched in soils because of mineralisation in underlying rocks, and obviously might be associated with mining activities. Here the BGS used something called the OVE ARUP database. You might be familiar with it. They converted this information into a GIS layer and built an environment, urban and industrial, where most people live and therefore the greatest health risks. Obviously, urbanisation and industrialisation means that we have a legacy of pollution in towns and cities. And for this element, the BGS used the General Land Use Database, which is freely available from the Office of National Statistics. So the outputs of the project included technical guidance sheets. As I mentioned earlier, these are the key elements that were looked at. Asbestos was initially looked at, but a lack of data on naturally occurring asbestos minerals in soil meant that they couldn't take that piece of work any further, unfortunately. So I just thought I'd show you a few examples of the maps, and as I say, these are available in the technical guidance sheets from Work Package 4. This one is the arsenic domain, 20th most abundant element in rocks. General diffuse anthropogenic sources of arsenic from dust particles and waste materials from mining, smelting processes and coal burning. This is a bit of the information that's within these technical guidance sheets, as well as the actual MBC itself, of course. In the built environment, increased levels of arsenic may be related to specific industrial land use, especially the metal industries. And interestingly, chromium copper arsenate, developed in 1933 as a wood preservative, but restricted in 2004 through regulation, is a potential source of this widespread contamination. Benzoate pyrene, spread by diffuse pollution and found in most soils. Natural sources, for example forest fires, are far outweighed by sources such as car exhausts and wood burning. Therefore, the populated industrial areas are more likely to have the higher concentrations of BAP. Now, availability of the data for organic contaminants in England was very scarce compared to inorganic contaminants. And this meant that the MBC calculations used soil from England, Wales and Scotland, not just England for this one. And final example is cadmium, of which there's an enrichment in the chalk soils of the North and South Downs, but for reasons unknown, not any further north. Associated with some mineralised areas and accompanying mining and processing activities such as ore smelting. Phosphate fertilisers and sewage sludges are also sources of cadmium in soil, and their presence in car tyres and motor oil accounts for an accumulation on the roadside. And of course, other important anthropogenic sources are NECAD batteries and of course coal burning. So that's just a quick run through of some of the maps. Bit more of the technical stuff. The upper limit for the MBC has been defined in this work as the 95% confidence limit of the 95th percentile. They can be used at national to regional scales as a guide to what are normal levels of contamination, and are meant for use to support the Part 2A contaminated land regime. And I think most importantly is the methodology. which can be applied at more local scales, provided that the sufficient data and representative data sets are available. So this is out there, it's out there for use. It was published in October. So hopefully you'll have come across it already, but if not, I suggest it. It's quite lengthy reading actually. It's numerous reports and technical answer sheets. Just thought I'd talk a bit more about the Category 4 screening level project. With SGVs and GACs wrongly used as a one-size-fits-all remediation target, there was a problem because they're not intended to be remedial targets either under Part 2A or under the planning system alongside which the Part 2A works. So the new 4-category test will introduce categories to describe broad areas of risk encountered by assessors, and the C4SL project is focused on producing a test for deciding land definitely sits within the Category 4, so it's definitely not contaminated land. I think so decreasing the overly cautious decision making and long delays on dismissing low risk sites and providing certainty for developers over whether land firstly needs to be remediated, and secondly to what extent it needs to be remediated to not be considered contaminated land, will help realise the majority of the monetised benefits I mentioned at the beginning, over the 140 million. There's no wriggle room on this work. We have a proposed end date of the 31st of May next year. It's a bit of a word jumble. There's some just key names, but I'm sure you might have seen on the Clare website, who are leading the consortium, the details of the work and a full list of the consortium membership. The work has been broken down into 3 work packages: design and methodology, developing that methodology using at least 2 test substances, and determining C4SLs for an initial suite of 6 substances. A lot of the same contaminants appear, similar to the background contaminants: BAP, benzene, arsenic, chromium, cadmium, and lead. Work package 1 is well underway, and part of that work will include reviewing parameter values used for exposure modelling, and reviewing the approach for deriving health criteria values. Some of the things the contractor will be taking into account when undertaking the work will be the level of risk which the C4SLs should aim to describe to achieve its objectives, likelihood of exposure, links between sources and receptors, toxicology play a key part, and the amount of site data that would be required to make a comparison with the C4SL. A number of land use categories have been looked at as part of this work. We have residential with gardens, residential without gardens, allotments, commercial, and also recreational public open space, for which I don't think SGVs actually exist. So I think this is a new land use. And the substances listed here provide a range of different properties and exposure pathways to test methodology. The first workshop was held yesterday in Birmingham, because obviously stakeholder engagement is a key part of the work, and there's a government steering group overseeing this. I missed off DCLG are also on this group alongside HPA, EA, and FSA, and obviously it's DEFRA led. So if you haven't already, a lot of the sector will be getting involved in that. It's an ongoing project. I think with regards to updating the industry, it will be as we go along, but it's, as I say, it's a piece of R&D, so we'll wait to see the outcome, but I think that's the more high profile project. Also quite high profile, I guess, is the National Expert Panel, which was announced a couple of weeks ago. The suggestion was, I've got here put forward by industry, but I think a few people are claiming the glory for this one. The idea is that the expert panel will respond to local authority approaches for the more difficult decision making. It's to, I guess in a way, provide the assurance that the decisions being made are the right ones. They won't actually be taking decisions. It's just an advisory capacity, and everyone on the panel is there as an individual expert. There are no affiliations for this. I think that the focus will obviously be on the 2-3 border, with a priority given to cases where there's a human health aspect. We're working as remotely as possible, and the only monies being exchanged are travel expenses. Terms of reference is currently being worked up, and this will be made publicly available, hopefully in the next 3 to 4 weeks. Here's a few of the. Well, in fact, I have 2 slides. The full membership. Andrew Wiseman, I believe, is very well known within the industry, is chair. Phil and Paul are here speaking today. And we have the Environment Agency. And I think, for me, importantly, the local authority membership, because I think they will be advising peers, and I think it will be hopefully more likely that local authorities will use the panel if their peers are sat on it and helping make the decisions alongside the other experts. So it was a key element when setting up the panel. The pieces of work will be written up. Each case will be turned into a case study. I think there's obviously not going to be. It's not to be considered a free consultancy for local authorities. It will only focus on a few key cases. I think we're thinking 10 to 12 initially. Obviously, the panel, as I say, are giving up their time freely, so we can't obviously expect them to be given advice for every case. So I think we'll be trying to hopefully have a selection of different types of cases that can then be used and disseminated wider once the final decisions are made. Once the guidance revision is, I think this benefits for you will come once everything's bedded in. We want to ultimately ensure it's been applied consistently and in proportion to risk. Want to see consistency, it's one of the key elements. And obviously, and very importantly, evidence that there's been a significant shift towards a risk-based approach. So just to finish up, I just wanted to also mention another piece of R&D which has kind of been recently published in September, undertaken by AMEC Environment and Infrastructure UK. The title of this piece of research was Options for a Strategy for Economic Assessment of the Benefits of Contaminated Land Remediation. And this slide here just shows how that project objective was broken down. Basically, 3 case studies were looked at: chemical works, a housing and open access area, with an emphasis on site value and neighbouring property benefits. Other types of benefits looked at were environmental and health. And basically, the report categorises conceptual approaches and types of benefit and assessment method. and these can be applied to a range of future studies with different strategic objectives. In part, the summary of the work was the case studies indicate that remediation is associated with benefits substantially in excess of probable cost, but it was difficult to attribute shifts in house prices to remediation despite their apparent relationship. However, the fact that similar results came across all three sites lends weight to the evidence in this case. So that was really just to say that this is out there. This is on the DEFRA website. It's a very interesting document and worth a read. So on that note, I will finish. Thank you.